Yes, good morning, dear students. So now that we have talked about cleavage, we talked about blastulation and implantation, today we have a beautiful process called as gastrulation. What exactly is gastrulation? First lecture we had talked about it. Gastrulation is the process in which we have three germinal layers form. Three layers ectoderm, mesoderm and endoderm बनते हैं जिसमें से बॉडी के अलग अलग पार्ट्स बनते हैं फीटस के and that process is called gastrulation. But sir, अभी last lecture हमने किया था that the entire baby develops from the embryoblast. Embryoblast of the blastula forms the entire baby. तो बेबी एम्ब्रियोब्लास्ट से बनती है, बेबी एक्टोडर्म, मीसोडर्म, एंडोडर्म से बनती है. तो दोनों का कनेक्शन क्या है? Sir, it is the embryoblast which gets converted into three layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, and that process is called as gastrulation. So, gastrulation is the conversion of the embryoblast into the three germinal layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. So, chalo, let's see how does gastrulation take place. If you remember, at the end of blastulation was formed a structure called as the blastula. The blastula had an outer layer of cells called trophoblast, an inner mass of cells called as embryoblast, a cavity inside called as blastocele, which was filled with uterine milk, and that structure was called as a blastula. अब ये blastula gastrula में कैसे कन्वर्ट होगा? ब्यूटीफुल प्रोसेस, प्लीज लिसन केयरफुली. सबसे पहले एम्ब्रियोब्लास्ट के ये छोटे छोटे राउंडेड सेल्स दिख रहे हैं आपको, एंड एम्ब्रियोब्लास्ट स्मॉल राउंडेड सेल्स का लोअर मोस्ट लेयर, जो सबसे नीचे वाला लेयर है, these rounded cells become flattened and ये flat हो जाते हैं and it forms the first germinal layer called as the endoderm. तो आपकी endoderm बन जाती है from the embryoblast cells. The lowermost layer of embryoblast cells becomes flattened to form the endoderm, which is called as the hypoblast, or hypoblast lowermost layer बन जाता है. Now, the remaining cells of the embryoblast fuse and become tall and columnar. तो remaining cells fuse होके tall और columnar बन जाते हैं, and these cells are called as the ectoderm. And ectoderm बन गया आपका, which is called as the epiblast. So we have the lowermost layer, which is called as the endoderm, also called as the hypoblast, and के ऊपर बन गई tall columnar cells का ectoderm, which is the epiblast. तो दो germinal layer आपकी बन गई. Such a simple process so far. And now, where will the mesoderm come from? Ectoderm, endoderm तो बन गया. Mesoderm कैसे बनेगा? Now comes the main challenge and the main process. अब ध्यान से सुनना sir. Sir, the tall columnar ectoderm cells नीचे flat endoderm cells will now sink. They start moving downwards from the poles towards the equator. तो बीच में आने लगते हैं एक्टोडर्म और एंडोडर्म सेल्स एंड नीचे की तरफ सिंक होते हैं. एंड as the ectoderm and the endoderm cells sink, they form a disc, and that disc is called as the embryonic disc. And the entire baby will develop from this embryonic disc. So embryoblast जिसमें से पूरा बेबी बनता है has become ectoderm, has become endoderm, and now has formed this disc called as the embryonic disc, and the entire baby will develop from this embryonic disc. So, as the tall columnar ectoderm cells sink, वो नीचे की तरफ जाते हैं, it will form a cavity. एक cavity बन जाती है above the ectoderm, and that cavity is called as the amniotic cavity. And amniotic cavity in the future will be filled with amniotic fluid, which will surround the entire fetus and act as a shock absorber for the child. तो ये amniotic cavity बन जाती है. And now ये जो trophoblast cells थे, I hope you remember, what is this outer layer of cells called? Trophoblast. Trophoblast cells start undergoing cell division once. एक बार ये trophoblast cells divide होते हैं to form a layer of cells. To form a layer of cells, and this layer of cells are called as the amniogenic cell. So trophoblast cell से एक बार cell division हुआ and it formed a layer called as the amniogenic cells. Amniogenic cells form the roof of the amniotic cavity. तो आपका जो amniotic cavity था ना बेटा, उसका roof बन जाता है with the help of amniogenic cells. And so ये आपके flat endoderm cells. Flat endoderm cells start undergoing rapid cell division. Flat endoderm cells का rapid cell division होता है, and they collect from each pole, each side, to enclose a sac, a cavity which is called as the primary yolk sac. Now that means, sir, दो cavities बन गई. ऊपर बन गई amniotic cavity और नीचे बन गया primary yolk sac. Abhi amniotic cavity, to be remember, is going to get filled with amniotic fluid, surround the fetus and act as a shock absorber. ये yolk sac क्या काम का है? Now sir, दूसरे animals में जो oviparous होते हैं, जिनमें yolk supplies nourishment for the developing fetus, उनमें yolk sac में yolk जमा होता है. But humans में yolk sac is empty. If you remember, all the yolk was anyway used for cleavage. तो yolk sac का काम क्या है? Yolk sac does not have yolk, but cells of the yolk sac, please remember, form the future germinal epithelium of the ovary. Germinal epithelium of the ovary is formed from yolk sac cell. And ovary की जो outermost covering germinal epithelium है, वो yolk sac cells के migration से होता है. And these germinal cells in the future will undergo oogenesis as early as the 3rd month of pregnancy itself. Because these cells are already dividing. Yolk sac cells are undergoing cell division. So germinal epithelium cells also form oogonia and cell division will continue in them. And along with the germinal epithelium, which is formed in females, yolk sac cells form fetal RBCs. Fetus के RBCs बनते हैं. Sir, fetus के अंदर bone marrow तो बना ही नहीं है. Bones तो बहुत time के बाद बनेंगे. But you require red blood cells for transporting oxygen from the mother into the fetus, and this oxygen is required by the fetus. So, fetal RBCs are required, fetal oxyhemoglobin is required in all the parts of the body. Who will form the first fetal RBCs? First fetal RBCs are formed by cells of the primary yolk sac. तो primary yolk sac बहुत काम का है. It forms the fetal RBCs in the male as well as female child, and in the female child it forms the germinal epithelium of the developing ovary. Beautiful. ये याद रखना. Now comes the main challenge, mesoderm. तो ऊपर amniotic cavity आ गई, नीचे primary yolk sac आ गया, and now आपके जो ये trophoblast cells है, the trophoblast cells everywhere start undergoing rapid cell division. और trophoblast cells rapidly divide करते हैं and they form a continuous collection of cells inside and form a layer, and that layer is called as the mesoderm. But sir, if you remember, the actual mesoderm comes from the embryoblast, and this mesoderm has come from the trophoblast. So this mesoderm is not going to participate in the formation of any fetal organs and is rightly called as the extra embryonic mesoderm. तो ये actual mesoderm नहीं है, this is the extra embryonic mesoderm. वो और कुछ बनाएगा. Mesoderm कहाँ बनता है? Sir, ये ध्यान से सुनना. This is tall columnar ectoderm cells. उसके नीचे ये flattened endoderm cells. And ध्यान से, in one circular area, flat endoderm cells become columnar. Flat endoderm cells columnar हो जाते हैं, and that area is called as the procordal plate. तो ये procordal plate बन गई. And इसे विजुअलाइज करेंगे. समझो ये एम्ब्रियोनिक डिस्क ऐसे था, and एम्ब्रियोनिक डिस्क ऐसे था, उसमें flat cells have become columnar, procordal plate. अब उस डिस्क को ये ध्यान से देखना, हम लोग ऐसे देख रहे हैं. So we are seeing it now like this. So this is the procordal plate. And ये procordal plate थी. And now डिस्क को हमने ऐसे देखा. So this is your procordal plate. The procordal plate forms the future head end of the baby. तो बेबी का हेड एंड प्रोकॉर्डल प्लेट से बनता है. अब तक कंटिन्यूस सेल डिवीजन हो रहा था. पहली बार कुछ डिफाइन हुआ है कि प्रोकॉर्डल प्लेट विल फॉर्म द फ्यूचर हेड एंड ऑफ द बेबी, एंड a line passing through the procordal plate forms the future central axis of the child. तो बेबी का central axis बनता है from the splitting of the procordal plate through a line cutting through the procordal plate. And ये central axis बनेगा तो ये बेबी के हैंड्स बनेंगे, ये बेबी के लेग्स बनेंगे, and the entire baby configuration is done by the formation of the procordal plate. तो ये procordal plate head end पे बन जाता है, and head end पे procordal plate. Opposite end, tail end पे tall columnar ectoderm cells के जो ये ectoderm cells है, some of these ectoderm cells break down, टूट जाते हैं, and they form a collection of small rounded cells, and this collection of small rounded cells is called as the primitive streak. And primitive streak के छोटे छोटे rounded cells start passing between the ectoderm and the endoderm to form the mesoderm. Yes, and this mesoderm has come from the primitive streak. And primitive streak ectoderm से बना था. And by the way, ये ectoderm embryonic disc, in other words, embryoblast से बना था. So embryoblast form the ectoderm, endoderm, which is the embryonic disc, And from the ectoderm develops primitive streak, and primitive streak cells form the mesoderm. So this mesoderm is the actual mesoderm, which is called as the intra-embryonic mesoderm. So ये actual mesoderm बना, and what is this mesoderm called as? The intra-embryonic mesoderm. It will form the future parts of the fetus. तो आपकी तीन लेयर बन गई. Tall columnar ectoderm cells, छोटे छोटे rounded mesoderm cells, and flat endoderm cells. And these are your three germinal layers, and this process is called as gastrulation. चलो इसका एक बार वापस रिकैप करते हैं. सो ध्यान से, ट्रोफोब्लास्ट, embryoblast, lowermost layer of embryoblast, flat, endoderm or hypoblast. Remaining cells become tall columnar. Ectoderm, also called epiblast. Ectoderm cells sink. As they sink, they form a disc. That disc is called as embryonic disc. The entire baby develops from embryonic disc. एक cavity बन जाती है, amniotic cavity, which will be filled with amniotic fluid, surround the future fetus. Shock absorption. Trophoblast cells undergo cell division once to form amniogenic cells, which form roof of the amniotic cavity. Endoderm cells undergo cell division to form cells of the primary yolk sac. Primary yolk sac cells form the fetal RBCs and germinal epithelial cells of the ovary. Trophoblast cells undergo cell division to form a collection of cells called as mesoderm. But this mesoderm is not from embryoblast, it is from trophoblast. So it is the extra-embryonic mesoderm. Main one. Endoderm cells at one circular area. Flat cells become columnar. Flat cells become columnar. That area is now called as the procaudal plate. Procaudal plate forms the future head end, and a line passing through it forms the central axis of the child. Hands, legs, etc. Procaudal plate, head end, tail end, tall columnar ectoderm cells in a circular area become broken down into small rounded cells. And these cells are called as the primitive streak. primitive streak cells spread between the ectoderm and the endoderm to form the mesoderm. This mesoderm has come from the primitive streak, which is a part of the ectoderm, which is embryoblast cells, and which means this mesoderm is going to participate in the formation of future organs of the baby and is rightly called as the intra-embryonic mesoderm. So तीन germinal layer बन गई आपकी ectoderm, mesoderm, and the endoderm, and this process is called as gastrulation. So gastrulation is finished 15 days after fertilization. So zygote forms morula, morula forms blastula. Remember, blastula is formed around the 5th day of fertilization, and gastrulation from the 5th day till the 15th day takes place. So about 10 days are required for gastrulation. And if you remember, implantation takes place from around the 7th, 8th day till the 12th day. And gastrulation is around the 10th day to the 15th day. Means implantation and gastrulation are taking place simultaneously. यहां बन रहा है कोरियोनिक विलाई फॉर इम्प्लांटेशन और नीचे बन रहा है एक्टोडर्म, मेसोडर्म, एंडोडर्म, गैस्ट्रुलेशन. ये दोनों प्रोसेस साइमल्टेनियसली हो रहे हैं. एंड सर एक ब्यूटिफुल पॉइंट. सर ये आपका मेसोडर्म बना. दिस वाज योर एक्स्ट्रा एम्ब्रियोनिक मेसोडर्म. Now this was formed. So ये क्यों बनता है? Why do we need extra embryonic mesoderm? Not given in your books properly. ध्यान से सुनना. और एक अच्छा point. So ये आपके ectoderm cells थे और ये आपके बन गए mesoderm cells और ये बन गए endoderm cells. Endoderm cells भी ध्यान से सुनना. So, you know that this is the procodal plate, head end है ये procodal plate. तो opposite end, tail end पे some of the endoderm cells separate out. Endoderm cells इससे separate out होते हैं और एक cavity बन जाती है, एक hole बन जाता है, and that hole is called as the blastopore. And this blastopore in the future will form the anus of the child. तो blastopore में से child का future anus बनेगा and endoderm cells from the blastopore start migrating forward and form a cavity. एक continuous tube बनती है और उस tube के अंदर एक cavity बनती है. That cavity is called as the archenteron, which is the primitive gut. Archenteron, primitive gut, in other words, digestive system banta hai. Sir, the internal lining of the digestive system is called as the archenteron or primitive gut. And ये internal lining बनता है digestive system का, and this is formed as early as the formation of the gastrula. So which is the first part of the child to develop? the blastopore which will form the future anus. ये सबसे पहला organ बनता है. And the first system to be formed is the digestive system in the form of the archenteron or the primitive gut. And we have a beautiful logic here. ये ध्यान से सुनना. Sir, you had that mesoderm called as the extra embryonic mesoderm. Now, जैसे 3 लेयर बन जाती है, extra embryonic mesoderm splits. तो कुछ सेल्स ऊपर की तरफ जाते हैं और कुछ सेल्स नीचे की तरफ जाते हैं extra embryonic mesoderm के. And some cells go up towards the trophoblast and some cells go down towards the amniogenic cell. याद है ये ट्रोफोब्लास्ट है और ये amniogenic cells है. तो कुछ ऊपर जाते हैं, कुछ नीचे जाते हैं, and the cells which go upwards form a layer which is called as the parietal or somatic extra embryonic mesoderm. तो ऊपर वाली लेयर कौन सी बनती है बेटा? Parietal or somatic extra embryonic mesoderm. और नीचे वाली जो लेयर बनती है is called as the visceral or splanchnic extra embryonic mesoderm. The visceral or the splanchnic extra embryonic mesoderm. तो ये दो mesoderms आपकी extra embryonic बनती है. And please remember, दोनों mesoderm के बीच में एक खाली जगह बन जाती है. Because now mesoderm has differentiated into 2 layers. There is a space created which is called as the extra embryonic coelom. Extra embryonic coelom, coelom yani empty space. So it is an extra embryonic coelom that is developed. Now, why did these 2 layers develop? So the parietal or the somatic extra embryonic mesoderm with the trophoblast will fuse and form the outer extra embryonic membrane called as the chorion. सर कोरियन जो फ्यूचर में फीटस को सराउंड करता है is made from the trophoblast cells and the parietal or somatopleuric extraembryonic mesoderm. And you remember these are amniogenic cells. Amniogenic cells with the visceral layer, and also some cells of the parietal layer. तो visceral और parietal दोनों के कुछ cells along with the amniogenic cells fuse together and form the layer called as the amnion. तो वो amnion बनता है. तो ऊपर बन गया आपका कोरियन और अंदर बन गया आपका amnion. And this amnion we are seeing is lining the amniotic cavity. Amniotic cavity को amnion line कर रहा है. And amnion is highly vascular. उसमें blood vessels होते हैं. उसमें से continuously lymph निकलेगा, which will form the amniotic fluid, which will fill the amniotic cavity. And amnion derived from the extra embryonic mesoderm, that is the visceral and parietal layers, and amniogenic cells. तो amniogenic cells से बनता है, and amniogenic cells से बनता है. By the way, amniogenic cells are called as extra embryonic ectoderm. Amniogenic cells को क्या कहते हैं बेटा? Extra embryonic ectoderm. So extra embryonic ectoderm and extra embryonic mesoderm. Extra embryonic ectoderm, which is the amniogenic cells, and the extra embryonic mesoderm. दोनों के फ्यूजन से बनता है amnion. So where is this amnion actually derived from? Extra embryonic ectoderm and extra embryonic mesoderm. तो ये याद रखना बेटा, amnion extra embryonic ectoderm, that is amniogenic cell से, और extra embryonic mesoderm visceral and parietal extra embryonic cell से amnion बनता है. Beautiful process called as gastrulation. चलो चेक है बेटा,